Zulrah can now be meleeed, and yes, it is good, but don't just be looking at a DPS calculator and call it a day, because it's a lot more nuanced than that. I've been doing all the math and a ton of testing, ranging from mid-game to end-game, camping one style to full switches. Let's break down exactly how this update has changed Zulrah forever. A popular option for lazy KCers at Zulrah has always been to camp range or magic. Now, you can camp melee with the Nox Halberd and the Crystal Halberd. How does it compare to the existing options though? Overall, I would say melee camping does fairly well, but there are some pros and cons with camping melee. For pros, it's great DPS, especially in mid-game setups where I think this really shines as an option. It's also great for max setups. It's much cheaper than using a Shadow or a T-Bow, and it's still fairly comparable to those. It's also very, very tanky against Blue Zulrah. You will tank so many ranged hits, and even if you do take the occasional hit, the odds of you taking the back-to-back 40 from Zulrah is so much lower compared to other sets, and that's where Zulrah was definitely most dangerous. The new spec weapon you're going to be bringing at Zulrah is going to be the Crystal Halberd, and it is very fun to use there. Zulrah can only take a max of 50, but because the Crystal Halberd is split up into 2 hit spots, you can hit 50-50, so you can hit 100 at Zulrah, and that just feels so good. On top of that, it has really good passive Grandmaster speed time potential because the Chally can just pop off. Lastly, this is optional, but you can camp the Serp Helm now if you're using the melee setup without any downsides because it actually gives you melee strength. For cons, Melee Zulrah definitely requires more precise clicking and placement. This has to do with Zulrah's southwest tile. Sometimes you'll click on Zulrah and you'll get swung in a direction you did not expect as a result of the southwest tile. This can lead to you missing attacks or taking some avoidable damage. Secondly, there's some unavoidable venom clouds. Sometimes you could go in and melee, maybe tank a little bit of a cloud, but other times there's way too many clouds for too long and you can't melee at all. This means that if you want to do at least a little bit of damage, you'll have to bring a range switch, which in my opinion is a con because it's extra switches and it deals a lot less damage. Lastly, the DPS calcs for this aren't really true to form because there are situations where you're not going to be meleeing. On the last point related to DPS, for camping one style, melee DPS is technically the highest DPS in both max setups and mid-game setups. But for max setups, it's so close to Shadow that when you factor in having to bring in the range switch due to the venom clouds, I'd make the argument that max Shadow does pull ahead slightly, especially since green phase Zulrah is where the Shadow cranks the most damage, and that's where we see Zulrah most. For mid-game setups, compared to Twin Flame and Bofa, for example, the gap is a little bit larger where I could see the argument of melee being the best option overall. I want to bring this DPS argument though one step further. When we are camping melee, it's going to be suggested to bring a 1 or 2 way at Lotl or Bofa switch. I think if we're going to be doing that for melee, we should afford the same courtesy for range and magic. The reason why melee camping at Zulrah is higher theoretical DPS than range and magic has to do with the fact that melee does the same damage to all 3 forms of Zulrah. For range and mage, you'll deal a lot of damage to 2 of the forms, but then there's one form where you'll deal a lot less damage. For mage, your DPS is low on blue phase. For range, your DPS is low on red phase. So what if we supplemented the bad DPS phases for range and mage with a 1 or 2 way switch? Kind of like what we're doing with Nox Halberd anyways with the range switch. And what's interesting here, Nox Halberd is a great option for both. For any mage setup, whether it's the Shadow or the Twin Flame Staff, if you bring a 1 or 2 way Nox Halberd switch, your DPS for blue form is going to go significantly higher. You are covering your bad DPS form. There may be one rotation where you can't deal the melee damage because of the venom clouds, but it's not too common overall. There are other switches too you could bring over Nox Halberd for mage. You could bring something like a T-Bow or a Bofa, but I think overall Nox Halberd is the best bang for your buck. For range setups though, you don't really have a great option as a 1 or 2 way switch. It's not like you could bring a 1 or 2 way Shadow, for example. However, the Nox Halberd is an amazing 1 or 2 way switch here. This means that you can do T-Bow or Bofa and bring a Nox Halberd just for the red phase, and you'll be dealing so much more damage. On top of that, the red phase doesn't really have any venom clouds that are ever going to block your damage. So let's revisit the DPS numbers, but let's replace the bad DPS forms that we get in range and magic with the 1 or 2 way Nox Halberd switch. All of a sudden, the Shadow and the T-Bow outperform the Nox Halberd setups in max. In the mid-game setups, the Bofa camp with a 1 or 2 way Nox Halberd looks like your best option. That being said, the Nox Halberd camp doesn't look bad at all here, and I like the fact that the Atlatls will do better in mid-game setups because you have more hybrid gear such as Barrow's Gloves and Fury. And honestly, Twin Flame Staff with the Nox Halberd, not that bad either. To cover camping one style overall, this shows you that the Noxious Halberd is a pretty good choice, especially in mid-game gear. However, it seems like you'd be better off bringing something like a Shadow, T-Bow, Bofa with a Noxious Halberd switch. DPS numbers aside, by adding Melee to Zulrah, it's clearly led to an influx of viable options when it comes to camping one style. You really can't go wrong, so I would just see what you got in your bank, what you have available. You can put together Mage, Range, or Melee, any of them will work, and in most setups you'll likely want to bring alongside the Noxious Halberd and Crystal Halberd. Outside of camping one style, how does this change affect setups that bring full switches, such as Shadow and T-Bow, or Shadow and Blowpipe, or Twin Flame and Bofa, etc, etc? Well, those setups are obviously better than any equivalent camping setup, that much is very clear, but these setups have still changed in a couple of ways. The biggest change is the fact that Crystal Halberd is practically a lock for your spec weapon. So if you're running any mage and range setup, you will bring a Crystal Halberd, and using that for your spec, you could bring it on its own, bring a 2-way, or even with a 4-way switch. I'd say if you're the type of player to teleport to your POH after every Zulrah KC, you probably could be comfortable with bringing a 2 or 4-way Crystal Halberd spec to maximize your spec usage. If you're not teleporting, then you have to be a little bit more conservative about your inventory, but it all comes down to comfort level. Overall, this change will make it so your KC is a little bit faster in these setups while costing you between 1 and 4 inventory slots. There is also one other form of setup you could use now. That is you bringing either range or magic alongside a full melee switch. Usually this isn't going to be as much DPS as bringing range and mage, but it could be an option if one of those two styles is particularly weaker for you. Melee can help to fill that plug as a serviceable option. I think it's especially good with mage setups because mage needs help with the blue form, so you could melee during the blue form and have the added benefit of being extremely tanky during the time of the fight where Zulrah can hurt you the most. Overall, not many people end up bringing mage or range with a full melee switch, but I did want to pitch it as a viable option, especially for those who have lacking gear in one of the two styles. And honestly, when it comes to going for a PB, mage and melee is a pretty solid combo. With the shadow damage on the first green phase and the potential for the Crystal Halberd to deal massive damage with a full melee switch, you can definitely get a very fast time. I was able to get a sub 40, and there were definitely a couple attempts where I could have gotten a lot lower if Zulrah died one attack earlier. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the Crystal Halberd spec because it's pretty nuanced in my opinion. I'll cover the simple case first. Using a Crystal Halberd on the opening cycle of Zulrah is never going to be a bad thing. If you're using something like a Shadow, T-Bow, Noxious Halberd, or Twin Flame, it's 3 attacks, then you spec with the Chally. If you bring a Bofa, it's 4 attacks, then Chally. However, with a 5-tick weapon, you could bring a faster weapon for a free hit in the beginning. This is something like a Trident, Bofa, or the Atlatls. That will give you that bonus hit. Second case I want to cover is for the players who will be restoring their spec after each KC. You'll want to obviously use 3 specs as soon as possible. For the first spec, exactly what I mentioned, you're going to get your 3 attacks in, 4 attacks in, and then spec. If Zulrah comes out red after that, it's 2 attacks in, and then spec. If Zulrah comes out green, it's 4 and then spec. If it's blue, it's 5 and then spec. Obviously though, the speed of the weapon will play a part here. You may also find it hard to spec with certain weapons like Blowpipe because it's very fast, so I would suggest specking during another phase. That covers your first 2 specs. For the third spec, you could likely get it in during the next rotation, but otherwise the easiest timing is when Zulrah's in the red phase. This is because the timing is fairly predictable with the tail attack. Also, the opportunity to Chally spec to end your KC will present itself from time to time, and this could save you multiple seconds if you get a good hit. Let's say you're not teleporting back to Zulrah after every KC. What is the best time to spec Zulrah? Firstly, once again, never a bad idea to spec at the beginning of the kill because it's so predictable. Really good if you're at 100 spec as well. Also, the end of the KC from time to time is going to be a great way to save a few seconds. Otherwise, when is it best to spec? It's always going to be best to spec when the Halley is going to take advantage of a low DPS form. This is mostly when you're using the camping setups. So let's say you're camping Shadow or Twin Flame, your lowest DPS is during the blue phase. So speccing with the Halley here is going to give you overall the highest opportunity cost. If you're camping T-Bow or Bofa, you typically want to spec during the red phase because that's your lowest DPS. Both these cases, you can also pull this off fairly easily if you're bringing a Noxious Halberd switch already for the blue and for the red phase respectively. If you're bringing multiple styles to Zulrah, this is less relevant. There's still going to be a lowest DPS form, but I'd say that's something to consider, but you probably just want to spec when it's most appropriate during the fight. Hopefully this info was helpful. As you can see, it's a little bit more nuanced than a DPS calculator, hence this video, but I do love all the variation and viability we have at Zulrah because of this change. There are so many options you can go with. So what's your preferred method for taking out Zulrah now that you can use Melee there?